Part 82. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 812. The man looked at Tang Shui and said angrily, "Who are you?" Tang Shui loosened his whip, frowned at him, and asked, "What are you doing in broad daylight?" The man snorted coldly and said, "They are the slaves of Zioan we captured. I can do whatever I want. You should stop meddling in other people's business." Tang Shui glanced at him and said, "What if I insist on taking care of it?" "Then don't blame me for being rude." The man's face darkened and he swung the whip in his hand. The biggest advantage after becoming prime minister is that you can arrange your own working hours, because in Shangshu province, Tangning and Wangxiang are the bosses. When entering the palace to go to the capital of Shangshu, Tangning met Prince Fu by chance. Prince Fu is the younger brother of Emperor Chen and the only prince among the previous generation of the Zhao royal family who stayed in the capital. He has a special status and is mainly responsible for handling matters related to the royal family. Tangning cupped her hands and said, "I've met King Fu." Prince Fu returned the greeting, "Mr. Tang, you're welcome." Although he is from the royal family, in terms of status, the young man opposite is not inferior to him at all. After the two greeted each other politely, Prince Fu was about to leave when he saw Tangning looking at him with burning eyes. He subconsciously touched his face and asked, "Is there something on my face?" No. Tangning shook her head, thought for a while, and asked tentatively, "Tang heard someone say that the prince was the most handsome man in the capital back then." King Fu was startled when he heard this, then a smile appeared on his face and he said, "Those are all in the past, not worth mentioning, not worth mentioning." Tangning nodded and whispered, "It's a pity." King Fu looked at him and asked, "What?" "It's nothing." Tangning bowed her hands to him and said, "The Minister of Finance is busy with affairs, so Tang will leave first." Watching Tangning leave quickly, King Fu reached out and touched his chin, which was full of fat. Realizing the profound meaning of what Tangning just said, his face darkened and he gritted his teeth and said, "You bastard, you are so young and amazing, wait a minute, when you reach my age, you may not be better than me." He touched his round belly, turned around and walked out of the palace angrily. When he returned to the mansion, he was still depressed. He took a sip of tea and said angrily, "You bastard." "Father, who made you angry again?" Princess Anyang walked in from outside and asked, "Which bastard are you talking about?" "Right, Chancellor Tangning." King Fu snorted coldly and said, "How dare he laugh at me?" "Him." Princess Anyang nodded subconsciously and echoed, "He is just a bastard." King Fu looked at her and said in surprise, "What did he do to you?" "He touched." Princess Anyang started to speak, then stopped abruptly, shook her head and said, "It's nothing." Then she looked at Prince Fu again and said, "Father, I have something to ask you." Prince Fu said without hesitation, "Do you want any money?" "I'm not asking for money this time." Princess Anyang glanced at him and said angrily, "Is it because of money every time I beg you?" King Fu looked at her and asked doubtfully, "Isn't it?" Princess Anyang took a deep breath and calmed down. A smile appeared on her face again and she said, "This time it's not about money. Shui'er was taken away by the punishment department. I want Dad to say hello to the punishment department and let her out." King Fu asked, "Why was she taken away by the Ministry of Punishment?" Princess Anyang said, "She taught a few scoundrels on the street." "Scoundrel?" King Fu glanced at her and asked, "Which scoundrel in the capital dares to offend the witch Tang Shui?" "The punishment department went crazy and caught her in prison because of a few scoundrels." Princess Anyang grabbed his arm, shook it, and said, "Oh, here and now, the Tang family is in decline, otherwise I wouldn't come to beg my father." Prince Fu said, "Who did Tang Shui offend?" Princess Anyang lowered her head and said, "The Zhou family." King Fu asked, "Zhou family, which Zhou family?" The next moment, he seemed to have thought of something and asked, "You mean the Zhou family?" Princess Anyang nodded and said, the Zhou family sells those Zioan people. Shui stood up for them and beat them up severely. Zhou Qing was also beaten. King Fu asked, is Zhou Qing seriously injured? It's not serious, just a few teeth lost, a few ribs broken, arms broken, legs broken. Princess Anyang said angrily, he was the one who made the rude remarks first and insulted us with his words. Prince Fu waved his hand and said, I have no control over this matter. Then what should we do? Princess Anyang looked at him and said, what if the Ministry of Punishment wants to punish him? Prince Fu shook his head and said, if it's another family, I can say hello to the punishment department, but it's not like you don't know about the Zhou family. Princess Anyang said, then I will go find brother Huai Wang. Prince Fu glanced at her and asked, it's not convenient even for your father. Do you think it's convenient for him? Princess Anyang was discouraged and said, then who should I look for? Go find that bastard. King Fu thought for a while and said, it would be more convenient for him to come forward in this matter. Princess Anyang asked, can it be solved if he just steps forward? Prince Fu shook his head and said, if he comes forward, His Majesty and the Queen Mother will not be able to blame us. Princess Anyang gritted her teeth and said, I won't go looking for that bastard. Prince Fu looked at her again and asked, where did that bastard touch you? After leaving the Yamen, Tang Ning walked out of Shangshu province and the palace gate. From a distance, she saw Princess Anyang standing at the gate of the palace. She didn't know who she was waiting for. Hello. When Tang Ning passed by Princess Anyang, she suddenly shouted. Tang Ning glanced at her and continued walking forward. Princess Anyang caught up and shouted, stop. Tang Ning looked back at her and asked, is the princess talking to me? Princess Anyang asked, besides you, is there anyone else here? First, I didn't say hello. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, second, isn't the princess a human? You. Princess Anyang closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and silently recited a few heart-clearing mantras before she calmed down and said, Shui was arrested by the criminal department. Tang Ning glanced at her, turned around and walked forward. Princess Anyang chased after her and said angrily, hey, where are you going? Did you hear what I said? Tang Ning glanced at her and said, go to the criminal department. Princess Anyang was stunned and asked, why don't you ask what happened? Tang Ning glanced at her and asked, is this important? Princess Anyang pursed her lips and said, she hurt someone. The person she hurt was a single member of the Zhou family, the Queen Mother's nephew. It is not easy to get involved in this matter. If it is not handled well, it will easily cause dissatisfaction with your Majesty and the Queen Mother. Tang Ning asked, what then? Princess Anyang looked at him and asked, are you listening? Of course Tang Ning listened carefully, but even the Emperor and the Queen Mother had to be reasonable. He believed that Tang Shui was not an unreasonable person. If he took 10,000 steps back, even if she was really unreasonable, Tang Ning could not let her stay in prison. In order to protect him, she traveled all the way from Chen to Chu. Tang Ning would never forget this friendship in her life. Princess Anyang saw that his pace was getting faster and she could no longer keep up. She picked up the hem of her skirt with both hands and sped up to follow him. She said dissatisfiedly, wait for me. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 813. Ministry of Justice. Song Yi looked at the petition in front of him and was a little upset. Miss Tang injured the son of Zhou. The only legitimate heir of the Zhou family seemed to be seriously injured. The Zhou family was furious and filed a petition to sue her directly to the Ministry of Justice. The case between the Tang and Zhou families is a hot potato, there is no doubt about it. Although the Tang family has declined, Prince Duan is still there, concubine Tang Hui is still there, Tang Shui is the daughter of Tang Jing, the secretary of the Central Secretariat, who has been in the position of the Secretary of the Central Secretariat for many years. I am afraid that in less than 2 years, he will enter the Shaanxi province to serve, and it is also not easy to offend. But compared with the Tang family, the Zhou family is more difficult to offend. Although the Zhou family does not have much power in the capital, its status is very transcendent, because the current queen mother is surnamed Zhou, and the head of the Zhou family, Duke Zhao Zhouwu, is the queen mother's biological brother. Zhou Qing, who was injured by Tang Shui, was the son of Duke Zhao in his old age and the only child of the Zhou family. How could the Zhou family let it go when his ribs were broken and his hands and feet were broken in the street? As long as the Zhou family cried and made a fuss at the queen mother, Tang Shui would be in big trouble. Duke Zhao was your majesty's uncle, and Zhou Qing was the queen mother's nephew and your majesty's cousin. Your majesty attached great importance to filial piety and generally would not disobey the queen mother. In this case, Tang Shui was obviously the one who was at fault. The Zhou family servants taught a few slaves from the western regions a lesson, which had nothing to do with her. She was wrong to her people because of this. Although Song Yi knew that even when the Tang family was at its peak, they would not provoke the Zhou family, but the Tang family still had people in the palace. After the Ministry of Justice detained Tang Shui, it immediately sent someone to notify the Tang family. Tang's house. Tang Qi, who had just received the news, looked at Tang Hui and asked, "Should we send someone to the palace to tell the fourth sister about this?" "What's the point of telling her?" Tang Hui glanced at him and asked, "Can she offend the Empress Dowager and His Majesty because of this?" Tang Qi looked at him and asked, "So what do you mean? Just ignore it." "She caused the trouble herself, so she should deal with it herself." Tang Hui frowned and said, "The Tang family is no longer the Tang family of the past. Does she still think that she is the eldest daughter of the Tang family and can do whatever she wants?" Tang Qi shook his head and sighed, "After all, she is a member of my Tang family." Tang Hui waved his hand and said, "The blood flowing in her body is not the blood of the Tang family." Inside the palace, a hall in the harem. Tang Huifei held a letter in her hand, glanced at it casually, then crumpled it into a ball and threw it aside. Although she has lived in the deep palace for a long time, she cannot be completely at ease because she has a son outside the palace who makes her worry. She has arranged many spies outside the palace, and she can know any major events in the capital at the first time. She had already learned about the conflict between Tang Shui and Zhou Qing of the Zhou family. Although Tang Shui's surname was Tang, and he was half of their Tang family, if it was an ordinary little thing, it would be fine, and she would not mind intervening, but Zhou Qing was the only child of the Zhou family, and the Zhou family was the Empress Dowager's family. If the Empress Dowager blamed him, even His Majesty would not be able to intercede, let alone her. After throwing away the letter, she quickly put the matter behind her. After a while, he left his palace and came to the door of a certain palace. Wei Jian stood at the door and bowed, saying, "Your Majesty, His Majesty has just fallen asleep. If you have anything to say, please come back after His Majesty wakes up." It was neither night nor noon. Concubine Tang Hui looked at him and asked, "Why is His Majesty resting at this time?" Wei Jian shook his head and said, "Perhaps His Majesty is tired of reviewing memorials these days and needs more rest." "Then let His Majesty have a good rest and don't let anyone disturb you." Concubine Tang Hui looked at him and said, "I'm leaving." Wei Jian bowed and said, "Your Majesty, take care." Concubine Tang Hui walked down the steps, and a palace maid came from the front holding an incense burner. She looked up at Concubine Tang Hui, then immediately looked away and hurried forward. Outside the palace, a young eunuch looked at her and said unhappily, "Why did you come so late? Your Majesty has been waiting for a long time." In a courtyard on a street somewhere in the capital, a woman looked at Tang Jing and said anxiously, "Why was Shui imprisoned in the prison? Go and see." "Don't worry, I'll go to the Ministry of Justice to find out." Tang Jing comforted her a few words, then walked out of the house quickly and went to the Ministry of Justice. After a while, in the Ministry of Justice, Song Yi looked at Tang Jing and shook his head, saying, "This case is originally the fault of Miss Tang, and the Ministry of Justice can only handle it impartially." Tang Jing looked at him and said, "The Tang family is willing to pay silver as a substitute for the crime." Song Yi shook his head and said, "The Zhou family has already said that they do not agree to pay silver as a substitute for the crime. This method is no longer feasible." Song Yi looked at him and said, "The Ministry of Justice has its own principles. Lord Tang also knows that this matter involves the Zhou family, and there are also the Queen Mother and His Majesty behind. This official is really helpless." Tang Jing arched his hands and said, "This official knows, but I just hope that Lord Song can take care of my daughter more and don't let her suffer in the prison." Song Yi nodded and said, "Lord Tang can rest assured about this." When Song Yi sent Tang Jing out of the Ministry of Justice, two figures came from the front. When they came closer, Song Yi bowed and said, "Greetings to the princess, and to Prime Minister Tang." Tang Jing looked at the two of them and also bowed and said, "Greetings to the princess, and to Prime Minister Tang." Tang Ning looked at Song Yi and said straight to the point, "I am here for Tang Shui's case." Song Yi said, "Tang Shui rewarded Zhou Qing of the Zhou family and is now imprisoned in the Ministry of Justice, awaiting his fate." Tang Ning said, "Let's release him first." Song Yi looked at a government official behind him and simply said, "Let him go." The 6 departments are the 6 departments of ministers. Although the 6 departments of ministers can write directly to the emperor, the prime minister is their immediate superior. The prime minister is in charge of all matters in the court, so it is natural to order the Ministry of Punishment to release someone. Song Yi was already troubled by this hot potato, but now that someone was willing to intervene, it was too late for him to be happy. Princess Anyang watched the punishment department release Tang Shui. When she walked out of the punishment department, she came back to her senses, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, "Is this the end?" Tang Ning glanced at her and asked, "What else?" Princess Anyang glared at him and said, "Don't get carried away, your troubles are still to come." Tang Shui looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Will there be any trouble if you ask the criminal department to let me go?" "Of course," Princess Anyang said, "are the Zhou family so easy to bully? Even if we are reasonable, it would be unreasonable for Duke Zhao to cry and make trouble in front of the Queen Mother when he enters the palace. What's more, we have no reason to begin with." "Reason?" Princess Anyang glanced at Tang Ning and said, "As a prime minister, you are using your power for personal gain and protecting criminals. Just 2 days after becoming prime minister, you abolished the official position for personal reasons. Let's see how you pass the test between His Majesty and the Queen Mother." Tang Shui stopped and said, "I'd better go back to the punishment department. No matter what punishment they want, I will bear it alone." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Just stay home and I will take care of the rest." Princess Anyang glanced at him and said, "I didn't expect you to be quite loyal, much more loyal than my father." Tang Ning said perfunctorily, "Thank you. Since you are so loyal, you won't stand idly by if I encounter any difficulties in the future." Princess Anyang showed a sly smile on her face and said, "After all, we can be considered friends." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Does it count?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 814. Princess Anyang narrowed her eyes at him and asked, "Doesn't it count?" "Forget it," Tang Ning nodded. This woman was not a cheap person, so Tang Ning didn't want to offend her too much. Princess Anyang said, "Since we are friends, lend me 10,000 taels of silver first." Tang Ning took out a stack of banknotes from her arms and said, "Exactly 10,000 taels." Problems that can be solved with money are not a problem for Tang Ning at all. He owes Princess Anyang a favor, and giving her these 10,000 taels of silver will be considered as a settlement. The fact that she was able to borrow money from Tang Ning meant that she was financially strapped. She wouldn't be able to pay back the 10,000 taels in a short time. During this period of time, she would probably have a better attitude towards her creditors. Of course, it would be better for her to stay hidden. Princess Anyang didn't expect Tang Ning to be so straightforward. She took the banknote generously and said, "I'll go back to my house and write you an IOU." "No need." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "We are all friends. 10,000 taels of silver is nothing. The princess can repay this money whenever she wants." "Really?" Princess Anyang raised her eyebrows and asked, "Is that okay if I pay it off in 10 or 20 years? Tang Ning smiled and asked, "Why not?" Tang Ning gave this money away without any thought of taking it back. He used 10,000 taels of silver to make her avoid Tang Ning for 10 or 20 years. Wouldn't it be considered that he had earned it? If she wanted to, she could spend her whole life paying it back. Of course, Tang Ning can't stay in Chen country for long. It can be as short as half a year or as long as a year, as long as she doesn't cause any trouble for him during this period. Princess Anyang put away the bank notes, looked at him with bright eyes, and said with a certain light in her eyes, "I like you as a friend." Tang Shui looked at her and asked, "What do you want so much money for?" Princess Anyang glanced at her and said, "Don't stand around and make sarcastic remarks. Holding banquets doesn't cost money, treating people to meals doesn't cost money, and buying clothes and jewelry doesn't cost money." Tang Shui shook his head and said, "I'm really worried about your future husband's family." Tang Ning was convinced of this. With the speed of Princess Anyang losing her fortune, few families in the capital could afford it. Tang Yaji also spends money like water, but the money she spends can be earned back 10 times or 100 times in the end. Princess Anyang is like a bottomless pit. No matter how much money she throws in, she can't make a splash. The three of them separated at the door of the princess's mansion. When Princess Anyang walked in, she looked back at Tang Ning and said, "The Zhou family is not a fuel-efficient lamp. You should be careful." Tang Ning waved her hand back and said, "Me neither. Isn't it just that he became the prime minister? His tail is raised to the sky." Princess Anyang curled her lips, walked into the house, took out the banknotes Tang Ning gave him and counted them. There were 10,000 taels in total. The smile on her face became even brighter. Even though she was born in the royal family, 10,000 taels was not a small amount for her, especially when she often made friends and held big banquets. This money could be said to be a solution. Her immediate concern. King Fu came out of the room, looked at her, and asked, "Where did you get so much money?" Princess Anyang said, "I borrowed it." King Fu glanced at her and said, "What's so exciting about borrowing it? Do you think you don't have to pay it back?" Princess Anyang counted on her fingers and said, "He said I can pay it back whenever I want. If I pay it back in 10 years, it will be less than 100 taels a month. If I pay it back in 20 years, it will be less than 100 taels. If it reaches 50 taels, if it is 30 or 40 years, we only need 10 taels a month, and 10 taels is not enough to buy a box of rouge." King Fu said, "How can anyone be so stupid?" Princess Anyang said proudly, "Some people are so stupid. There is no free chicken drumstick in the world." King Fu looked at her and reminded, "Be careful, he has plans for you." Princess Anyang said indifferently, "Don't worry, no one can take advantage of me." King Fu was not worried about this. His daughter was more thoughtful than him. Indeed, no one could easily deceive her. He stopped talking about it and asked instead, "How did things go today?" "The Ministry of Punishment has released him." Princess Anyang said, "This Prime Minister is still of some use. Without this power, what else can the Prime Minister do?" King Fu glanced at her and said, Even if the Prime Minister is a cabbage, and there are only 2 in the entire Chen kingdom, he is still that tender one, not just another one a pig can do it. But there is the Queen Mother behind the Zhou family. If the Zhou family gets to the Queen Mother, will he be in big trouble? Princess Anyang is still a little worried. After all, she and Tang Shui brought this matter to light, and it was she who took the initiative to ask for help. Tang Ning, if something happened to him, he would be uneasy. There will be trouble, but it won't be big. Prince Fu waved his hand and said, don't be fooled by his appearance. The Tang family, Prince Duan, Prince Kong, and Prime Minister Feng have all opposed him. You see, look at their current fate, and look at him, this person is not a kind person. Princess Anyang asked, but even if he is the Prime Minister, he cannot use his power for personal gain. Aren't you afraid of His Majesty's blame? He has already become the Prime Minister. What's wrong with being a little arrogant? General Zhou Xiaoyi, Marquis of Dingguo, is the right minister. If he is not allowed to make mistakes, should he be allowed to make meritorious deeds? King Fu looked at her, shook his head and said, it's a kind of wisdom that you don't understand. Princess Anyang thought for a moment and asked, did your father say that I have no wisdom? You are at least a little smart. Prince Fu looked at her and said, those people are the ones who really have great wisdom. You'd better stay away from them. Why? Princess Anyang looked at him in surprise and said, the more such a person is, the more we should make friends, right? Foxes should befriend rabbits, not tigers. King Fu said solemnly, I'm afraid you'll burn yourself while playing with fire. Princess Anyang showed a smile on her face and said, I prefer to be friends with tigers than rabbits. In order to prevent anything from happening to the Zhou family in the past 2 days, Tang Ning did not let Tang Shui go back and let her stay at home. After lunch, Xiao Ju walked in from outside and said, how dare you touch the Zhou family? Tang Ning glanced at him and asked, are you actually free to come out? After listening to Tang Ning's words, Lu Ya asked Xiao Ju to stay close to him. Under normal circumstances, he would not appear alone. Xiao Ju said, I'll go out and buy a box of preserves for her. I'll stop by and sit for a while. He looked at Tang Ning again and asked, aren't you afraid that the Zhou family will go to the palace to complain and the Queen Mother will cause trouble for you? Afraid? Tang Ning nodded and said, but there are some things that you can't just avoid doing because you're afraid of trouble. Do you need my help? Xiao Ju looked at him and said, I can still say a few words to the Queen Mother. Tang Ning shook her head and said, no, I won't cause any trouble to you. What kind of trouble is this? Xiao Ju waved his hand and said, you cured my disease and saved my life. This is nothing. No matter what happens, I, Xiao Ju, will always stand by you. This side. Some straight men have no skills at all when talking to girls, but they do the same thing when flirting with their brothers. However, this doesn't look like Xiao Ju's style. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, do you have any? What do you want from me? Xiao Ju looked at him and said sheepishly, can I sleep with you for a few days? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 815. Of course, Tang Ning rejected Xiao Ju's request with righteous words. He and Xiao Yi, who is as young as Tang Yao Yao, can't sleep together, so why should he sleep with Xiao Ju? However, Tang Ning still gave him an idea. The Ximen Guard had just been established, and as the general of the Ximen Guard, Xiao Ju, eating and sleeping with the soldiers of the Ximen Guard for a few days, it was not a reason that he couldn't say. After Xiao Ju left, Tang Ning continued to think about the previous question. Since King Kong rebelled and Emperor Chen appointed him as the right prime minister, he has been promoted to no higher and rewarded, unless he gave up his throne to him, which is of course impossible. At this time, making some mistakes appropriately, showing that he has been arrogant and floating, and he doesn't need to reward him anymore, can also be regarded as a reassurance to Emperor Chen. Of course, Tang Ning didn't think so much when he asked Song Yi to release him. There are only a few people in this world who treat him well without asking for anything in return. How can he let them suffer? However, there are still some arrangements to be made for the Zhou family. Zhou family. As a royal relative and the current Empress Dowager's family, the Zhou family has been low-key for many years, but it was once glorious and prominent. However, as an era passed, the Zhou family had no successors, and in this generation, the family was even more sparse, with only one child, which was considered to be completely in decline. When the Empress Dowager and His Majesty are gone in a few years, the Zhou family will become the last of the powerful in Beijing. But at least now, they still have the Empress Dowager as a backer in the palace. At this time, Zhou Qing, the only child of the Zhou family, was lying on the bed with a swollen nose and face. One arm and thigh were tightly wrapped in white cloth, and he groaned in pain from time to time. "My poor son!" An old woman beside the bed cried. That woman actually treated Qing so harshly, she must not be let off. Another old man said with a gloomy face, "I have already told the Ministry of Justice, this case must be severely punished. The Tang family is now in decline. I don't think the Ministry of Justice will protect her. Qing's revenge will be avenged soon." As soon as he finished speaking, a servant hurriedly ran in and shouted, "Master, Master, it's bad, Tang Shui has been released by the Ministry of Justice." What? The old man looked gloomy and asked, "Are you sure?" "Absolutely true," the servant said. "I saw with my own eyes that Tang Shui and Princess Anyang were walking on the street, there is no mistake." "What is the Ministry of Justice doing?" The old man snorted coldly and said, "I will go ask Song Yi what he means." "Ministry of Justice?" Song Yi looked at the angry old man and said, "Duke Zhao, calm down. This is the order of Prime Minister Tang. The Ministry of Justice is just following orders." The old man's face froze and asked, "Prince Tang?" Song Yi nodded. The old man knew who the Prime Minister Song Yi was talking about. He was at the forefront of every major event that happened in Beijing in recent years. In the past 2 years, he fought against the Tang family, Prince Duan, Prince Kong, the Jiangnan party, and the powerful people in the capital. None of his opponents had a good end, but he himself had already sat on a high position below one person and above 10,000 people. If there was anyone in the capital that he didn't want to provoke, Tang Ning would definitely be the first. His face changed, and after a decision, he laughed dryly. Since it was Prime Minister Tang who spoke, let's just let it go. It's normal for young people to have conflicts and contradictions. He bowed to Song Yi and said, "I'm going back." Song Yi knew that he didn't want to provoke Tang Ning, so he smiled and bowed, saying, "Goodbye, Duke Zhao." Tang Ning had learned from Princess Anyang and Tang Shui that they were really wrong this time. The cause of the incident was very simple. The servants of the Zhou family were selling slaves from the western regions on the street. Tang Shui couldn't bear it, so he went up to argue with them. Who would have thought that the servants of the Zhou family didn't know the witch of the capital at all, and they started fighting as soon as they disagreed. There were also many dirty words against the two women. Tang Shui naturally had to fight back. Seeing that she was strong, the servants of the Zhou family wanted to bully the few with their numbers, but in the end, including their young master, they all lost. If we really say that Tang Shui is responsible, it is not right. After all, she had tried to reason with him. He was the first to attack, but the result was that the Zhou family's young master and servants were killed, and she was intact. This responsibility cannot be shirked. Fortunately, she was careful in her actions. As long as Zhou Qing's bones are connected, he will recover after a period of rest, and he will not become disabled and affect his future life. Even so, Tang Ning still sent a large cart of gifts to the Zhou family. Most of these gifts are precious tonic herbs. In terms of value, they are enough for Zhou Qing to break more than 100 times. The Zhou family seemed unwilling to care about this matter. They accepted the gifts without saying much. What Princess Anyang expected did not happen. In the courtyard, Tang Ning looked at Tang Shui and said, "Even if you have to do it in the future, you have to be gentle and don't take people's hands and feet at will." Tang Shui lowered her head and said, "I know." Then she looked at Tang Ning again and said, "I have something to ask you." "Remove the word ask." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "We are a family, so there is no need to be so polite." Tang Shui raised her head and said, "I want to help those Western slaves in the capital." Tang Ning could understand her thoughts. Tang Shui originally had Western blood, so it was normal for her to feel sympathy for those Western people. The sale of human beings is legal in Chen State. Of course, the premise is that you are willing to do so and not through illegal means such as deception and abduction. Many poor families, unable to make ends meet, would choose to sell their daughters to wealthy families as maids, but the situation in the western regions was different. The environment in the western regions is difficult, and merchants from the Chen kingdom often go deep into the western regions, buy some women from the western regions, bring them back to the capital, and sell them to high-ranking officials as maids or concubines. Ever since Chengguo and Zioan became hostile, these people were not willing to pay even a little extra cost. They went directly to the western regions to plunder the Zioan people. The men they robbed were slaves and the women were maids. The government had always ignored this. After all, they were robbing people from the western regions, and the western regions' people were enemies. In the eyes of some people, they might not even be considered human beings. This actually reminded Tang Ning of Chengguo a few years ago. What Chen State is doing to the western regions now is exactly what the grassland has done to Chen State in recent years. In essence, there is no difference between Chen people and Sushan people. According to the education Tang Ning received, people are not commodities and cannot be bought or sold. Every life should be respected. However, in today's world, his ideas are too advanced. Tang Yu walked over and said, "Since Shui said it, you can help her think of a solution." Tang Ning turned around and said, "Mom." Tang Yu said, "The people in the western region are just like us. They are also human beings and should not be treated like this." Tang Ning nodded and said, "I will find a way." He agreed to this not only because two people who were important to him spoke out, but also for the sake of humanity in his heart. Tang Yu sat down and said, "Your father and I were able to escape from the capital back then because of their help. This is what our Tang family owes them." This was the first time Tang Ning heard her talk about the details of what happened back then. This was a rare opportunity. He sat down and asked, "Mom, how did you escape back then?" Tang Yu had a look of reminiscence on her face and said, "Back then, the relationship between the western regions and Chen State was not so tense. All the countries in the western regions sent envoys to the capital. The imperial court was also very tolerant of them and even allowed them to enter the imperial college and imperial college. Students from Chengguo studied together." She paused for a long time before saying, "It was at that time that your father met an envoy from Zioan. They hid us in the envoy, helped us escape from the capital, and escaped all the way." Tang Ning asked, "What happened next?" A trace of gloom appeared on Tang Yu's face, and she said, "Later, we were found by the Tang family, and then, I was brought back by the Tang family." Tang Ning saw the difference in her expression and changed the subject, "So, that Zioan envoy has indeed been very kind to us. Where is he now? I must repay him if I have the chance." "I don't know where he is now, or whether he is dead or alive." Tang Yu shook her head and said, "Your father had a close relationship with him back then. When I fled, I was pregnant, and he also had an affair with the Chen. The daughter of the country gave birth to a daughter, and they also made a stipulation that if I gave birth to a daughter, I would be married to his daughter, and if it was a boy, they would be married in the future." Tang Ning looked surprised. He didn't expect that such a thing happened 20 years ago. He couldn't find out about it from the files of the Ministry of Justice. There are already enough wives in the family, but I didn't expect that he would actually have a baby to marry. However, more than 20 years later, if the girl was still alive, she would have been married long ago. Tang Ning was not worried and looked at Tang Yu. He asked, "Mom, I would like to take the liberty to ask, where is that girl now and what is her name?" Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 816. He had a fiancée whom he was married to on the fingertips of his body. This was the first time Tang Ning heard about this. Although after so many years, he already has a family, and it is unlikely that the other party will be alone and unable to fulfill the promise he made back then, the other party's family is kind to them. If there is anything that can be done to help, Tang Ning will naturally lend a helping hand. With his current identity and status, even if he cannot give them much power, he can still give them wealth. Tang Yu looked at him and said, "Back then, we were separated by the pursuing soldiers. I took his daughter back to the capital and entrusted her to be raised by others, until now." After hearing what she said, Tang Ning already had some impressions of her fiancée. She is half Western. She is older than herself. She grew up in the capital and was raised by someone whom her mother trusted very much. It would be stupid if he didn't know who his mysterious fiancée was at this time. He turned his head and glanced at Tang Shui. Tang Shui crossed his arms and listened to the story with great interest. Suddenly, the story stopped. When he raised his head, he found that both of them were looking at her, wondering, "What are you looking at me doing?" As soon as Princess Anyang got off the carriage, she saw Tang Shui running out of Tang's house with a red face, and said in surprise, "What are you doing? Hey, slow down, wait for me." A moment later, in the west district of the capital, Princess Anyang held onto the door frame and panted, "You, why are you in such a hurry?" Tang Shui stepped into the courtyard gate, and a woman walked out of the inner room and said in surprise, "Shui is back." Mother Tang Shui stepped forward and said, "I want to ask you something." The woman asked, "What happened?" Tang Shui looked at her and asked, "Who are my biological parents?" The woman looked at her and said in surprise, "Why do you suddenly ask about this?" Tang Shui held her hand and said, "Mom, just tell me." Mom has said it many times, but she doesn't know very well. The woman shook her head and said, "It was your sister-in-law who brought you back, and she is the only one who knows your life experience." Tang Shui couldn't help but asked, "Does that mean what my sister-in-law said is true?" The woman looked at her, turned around and walked into the room. After a while, she took out a small box and said, "This is what your sister-in-law left for you back then. She said it was left to you by your parents until you get married. Open it again." Princess Anyang looked over and asked, "Why do you have to wait until you get married?" The woman shook her head and said, "I don't know about that." The woman didn't know, but Tang Shui knew. They were married by fingertips, but they did not escape from the Chen kingdom. My sister-in-law thought that Tang Ning was dead that year, so she never mentioned the marriage. The reason why she waited until she got married was because she didn't want her to be bound by this marriage. The woman looked at the locked box and said, "The key to this box is with your sister-in-law, and we have never opened it." Tang Shui took the wooden box, took the lock, and pulled it off gently. When the box was opened, a faint musty smell came out. There was a pair of small shoes, a rattle, and a yellowed piece of cloth in the box. She took out the piece of cloth. There were words on the cloth. The front was in Chinese and the back was in words that she couldn't understand. Tang Shui looked at the words on it. Princess Anyang came over and exclaimed, "Marriage certificate, who marriage certificate? Life is full of surprises." In a short period of time, Tang Ning inexplicably lost a cousin and gained a fiancée. This made Tang Ning very embarrassed. If something like this happened, how would he face Tang Shui and the ladies at home in the future? Tang Yu looked at him and said, The reason why I didn't tell Shui'er about this was because I thought you had encountered an accident 20 years ago and didn't want to affect her life. Now more than 20 years have passed since this incident. I don't know if Shui'er's parents are still alive. You should handle this matter yourself. How else could Tang Ning handle it? Her parents ordered her to marry at the fingertips. He had no experience in handling this matter. This matter was very embarrassing for both Tang Shui and him. The best solution was to not mention it to anyone and just pretend that it had never happened. He returned to his study, took out pen and paper, and prepared to draft a paper. Regarding the slaves in the western regions, Tang Ning felt that this should not be the case. Even the two hostile parties should treat people as animals for sale in a humane spirit. In this way, the Chen state, a country of etiquette, and the barbarians they called what's the difference. This is not only the case for Chen state. If they can reach an agreement with Zioan on this matter, both Chen state and the western regions will avoid a lot of tragedies. I really didn't expect it. Princess Anyang walked in from outside, looked at her with a strange look, and said, "So you are Shui'er's fiancé?" Tang Ning didn't even raise her head and said, "That was more than 20 years ago." Princess Anyang said, "So you want to regret it?" Tang Ning said, "This is not a regret. At that time, she was still young and I was not born yet. Marriage is a matter of parents' order. What does the matchmaker's words have to do with the fact that she is still young and you were not born?" Princess Anyang said, "You have your parents' orders, and you still have the marriage certificate, which means you have a marriage contract. If to regret the marriage, both parents must agree, otherwise it would be unfaithful and unfilial." Tang Ning was about to forget about this incident, but Princess Anyang disturbed her thoughts. He looked up at her and asked, "Is Princess Anyang here to pay me back my money?" Princess Anyang was stunned for a moment, then a smile appeared on her face and she changed the topic. "What are you writing?" Tang Ning didn't answer, and Princess Anyang didn't feel embarrassed. She took the initiative to step forward and take a look. After a moment, a look of shock appeared on her face and she said, "You are crazy. Do you know how many people's interests will be harmed by prohibiting human trafficking? Aren't you afraid of offending them?" Tang Ning asked, "Have I offended not many people? Then why did you?" "For conscience sake. He who is barefoot is not afraid of those who wear shoes. Since he has offended many people, why would he care whether he offends more people or offends the same people he has offended before? The things he did before were for revenge and to help King Run pave the way. What he is doing now is just for his conscience." Princess Anyang looked at him and said, "Those poor people cannot afford to raise their children. Only by selling them to rich families can the family survive. The court has always encouraged this. If you do this, you will offend the powerful and the court, and you will also offend the court. It will offend the people." Tang Ning thought about it and felt that what Princess Anyang said made sense. Since he is in this era, he cannot copy everything from later generations, and he must also consider the actual situation. After thinking about it for a while, he crossed out some of them. We cannot prohibit the common people from selling their children to wealthy families in exchange for the possibility of survival, nor can we prohibit consensual human transactions, such as the exchange of concubines and maids between the rich and powerful. What needs to be prohibited is that they use violent means to kidnap people from the western regions, treat them like livestock, and sell them to the powerful in the capital. The state of Chen allowed normal human trade, but the punishment for those who committed deception, abduction, or robbery by force was extremely severe. If the principal culprit was caught, he would be executed. However, this law was to protect the people of the Chen state, and the people of the western regions were not among them. Of protection. Princess Anyang looked at it and said, "Isn't this what Shui'er wants to do? What else do you say for the sake of conscience? She is your conscience." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 817. Princess Anyang knows too much about Tang Ning. She knows about the things with Zhao Man, she knows about the things with Tang Shui, and she also knows about her mother's affairs in the Tang family. If it were a cruel and ruthless person without feelings, she might have been killed long ago. With her figure and beauty, it is possible that she would do something more excessive before being killed. Of course, Tang Ning is a serious person and will not do things that repay kindness with enmity. He has always abided by the law and will not do those excessive things to her. Princess Anyang saw his strange look and asked cautiously, "What do you want to do?" Tang Ning looked at her and explained, "Although there are parents' orders and matchmakers' words, marriage is a matter of lifelong happiness. Shouldn't it be up to you to decide?" Princess Anyang looked at him and said, "So you still want to break off the engagement?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Princess, what you mean is that your marriage will be completely decided by the prince and princess, even if they ask you to marry a beggar, would you agree?" Princess Anyang said, "They won't let me marry a beggar. It is said that big breasts mean no brains, and big butts mean no brains either." Tang Ning's thoughts were a little confused by her. Princess Anyang changed the subject and asked, "Are you really determined to do this? This is a thankless task. Cutting off someone's financial resources is like killing their parents. You cut off their financial resources again and again. Aren't you afraid that they will join hands to deal with you?" "So what?" Tang Ning said calmly, "I only have one sister. How can I stand by and watch what she wants to do?" Princess Anyang looked at him, thought for a while, and said, "If you want, you can have two." Tang Ning looked at her with a puzzled look on his face. Princess Anyang looked at him and said with a smile, "I am older than you. If you don't mind, you can call me sister." Tang Ning looked at her, thought for a moment, and asked, "You don't want to pay back the 10,000 taels of silver, do you?" Princess Anyang had a good plan, but Tang Ning did not agree to it. What sister, he doesn't believe now. Su Mei used to be his sister, and now he is his fourth wife. Tang Shui was once his cousin, and now he is his fiancé. Tang Ning may be destined to have no sister, not to mention that the motive of Anyang County Lord is not pure. She wants to get close to Tang Ning just because she likes his money. Tang Ning does not want to become her ATM. He has already written a memorial about liberating slaves in the western regions. In the past, Tang Ning might have to ask Emperor Chen for instructions on such matters, but now he can make his own decision. The purpose of the Prime Minister is to share the pressure for the Emperor. It is impossible to leave everything to Emperor Chen. Moreover, since King Kong rebelled, Emperor Chen fell ill once and his health has not been very good. He is cooperating with the imperial physician to recuperate, and the affairs of the court are fully handed over to Tang Ning, Wang Xiang, and King Huai. Shang Shidushan, Wang Xiang looked at his memorial and said, "I know that Tang Xiang has a kind heart, but if this matter is to be promoted, the resistance encountered is no less than when you streamlined the tax system in the past." Tang Ning naturally knew this. The court repeatedly banned human trafficking because of the huge profits involved. There are prostitutes in the human trade, but there are many more people hiding in the dark than those who can be seen in the open. For those people, this is simply a business with no capital. They cheat and deceive children and women, and they don't have to pay any price except the risk of being discovered. And kidnapping people from the western regions does not even have this risk. The court's laws protect the people of Chen State, not the enemies of the western regions, and a beautiful woman from the western regions can easily be sold for hundreds or thousands of taels of silver in the capital. All they have to pay is the travel expenses from the western regions to the capital. For those people, as long as there is a 50% profit, they can take risks. With a 100% profit, they dare to trample on all laws. With 3 times the profit, they dare to commit any crime and are willing to risk being beheaded. The profit from plundering captives from the western regions is more than 3 times, it is 30 times, 300 times. Many people in Beijing make a living and get rich from this. Tang Ning wants to move a piece of cake that is even bigger than the tax system streamlining. But what does it matter? He demolished the cake shop in Jiangnan and didn't care about the few small dignitaries in the capital. In fact, he was still worried that there were no mistakes to make, and he needed them to give him a chance. Tang Ning looked at Wang Xiang and said with a smile, "We are sitting here, doing things for the people. We can't give up easily just because we encounter difficulties. In this world, what can we do without encountering difficulties? If we give up as soon as difficulties arise, what can we accomplish? Young people are to be feared." Wang Xiang looked at him and said, "If you want to do it, do it. We old guys also want to see how far you can go." When this memorial was delivered to King Huai put it down, looked at him, and said, "There are many powerful people in the capital who make money from this business. The last tax system was already a cut from them. If the sale of slaves in the western regions is completely banned, it will cut off their roots. They will definitely fight to the death with Lord Tang." Tang Ning smiled and asked, "Are there not many people in the capital who are fighting to the death with me?" King Huai glanced at him and asked, "Can I ask, this matter has nothing to do with Mr. Tang in the first place, so why are you fighting those people to the death for this matter? What Chengguo is doing to the western regions now is not what the grassland did to Chengguo in the past." Tang Ning looked at him and said, "Your Highness has never been to the grassland, and you don't know how the Han people who were kidnapped by the Sushan people lived there. What kind of life, what kind of bullying they suffered. They had no clothes on their bodies, no food to eat, and were often beaten by them. Even if they were beaten to death, they were just randomly thrown on the grassy beach and cut into pieces by wild wolves. Vultures eviscerate." He glanced at King Huai and said, "Our Chen country is known as a country of etiquette, but what is the difference between the behavior of a country of etiquette and what we call barbarians?" King Huai shook his head and said, "This matter is much more difficult than streamlining the tax system. I still advise Lord Tang to be wise and protect yourself." Tang Ning shook her head slightly and said, "This matter does not depend on whether our position is the Chen Kingdom or the Western regions. Your Highness grew up in a rich life and has never suffered the hardships they have suffered, nor has he been bullied by them." "I understand." Boom. King Huai slammed the table, stood up suddenly, and said through gritted teeth, "How do you know that I haven't suffered the same hardships they have suffered, and I haven't been bullied like they have?" Tang Ning looked at him in surprise and asked, "Your Highness?" King Huai closed his eyes, took a deep breath, sat down again, his expression returned to calm, and said, "I'm sorry, I lost my temper just now." "It doesn't matter." Tang Ning glanced at him, took the book and left. "Wait a minute." Tang Ning turned around and looked at King Huai. King Huai looked at him and said, "My father has handed over the affairs of the western regions to me a long time ago. Since Mr. Tang wants to do these things, how can I avoid it?" Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Your Highness, are you not afraid that they will fight us to the death?" King Huai said, "When they die, they will be divorced." "That's very good." Tang Ning handed him the envelope and said, "This time, either they die or we live." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 818. The western regions and the grasslands have completely different meanings to Chengguo. The grasslands are the life and death enemy of Chen state. They are extremely fierce. For decades, they have burned, killed, and looted on the border of Chen state. They regard the Han people as cattle and sheep and humiliate them wantonly. Chen state calls them barbarians, which is a bit fearful. Factors in it. Now that the grassland and the Chen kingdom are at peace, the people feel more relieved, and the fear of the Sushan people in their hearts has not disappeared. As for the western regions, since the founding of Chen state, the western regions have been vassals of Chen state. They have never had a war with the Chen state. They regard the Chen state as a superior state and will pay tribute every few years. When the people of the Chen state meet people from the western regions, they will naturally feel superior. Because women from the western regions are more beautiful and more exotic and wild than Han women, there are many powerful officials in the capital who like to take women from the western regions as concubines. However, the western regions are too far away from the capital, so their demands are often met with failure. Not satisfied. Decades ago, someone discovered the business opportunity in this. They carried a large amount of materials and went deep into the western regions in exchange for women from the western regions. Since most of the small countries in the western regions were poor, they could exchange a living person back with a small amount of silk, tea, and porcelain, and then sold it to the upper class in the capital at a high price, and continued to use it. The silver gained can be used to expand the size of the caravan. By going back and forth several times in this way, one can accumulate an extremely huge wealth. Of course, businessmen pursue profits, and some people are not even willing to pay the small costs. They secretly abduct women from the western regions and abduct them back to the capital, doing business that has no capital but can obtain huge profits. The imperial court had explicitly prohibited this before. Chengguo claimed to be a state of etiquette, so naturally it could not do such a thing to its friends. But one moment after another, Zioan has become increasingly powerful in recent years, posing a huge threat to Chen state. With constant friction on the border between the two countries, Chen state will naturally not legislate to protect its enemies. This has led to some people becoming more aggressive, unabashedly and unscrupulously engaging in human trafficking. Ironically, although Zioan was in a tense situation with the Chen state, they never killed or tortured prisoners, nor did they burn, kill, or loot at the Chen state's border. They would use Chen state's prisoners of war to exchange for their own prisoners. He also sent envoys to Beijing to protest against the atrocities committed by some powerful officials in Chen state. Of course, Chengguo ignored this. Even if some censors made some suggestions on this matter out of inner shame, they were quickly drowned out by the voices of opposition. To Chengguo, Zioan is like a younger brother with stiff wings. He has always been an inferior younger brother, but one day he will break away from Chengguo's control and fly solo. Naturally, he will not feel comfortable being the elder brother. Chuguo was once Chengguo's younger brother, and he also wanted to fly solo. Chengguo's attitude towards Chuguo was completely different from that towards Zioan. This was because Chuguo's wings were too hard, so hard that Chengguo didn't even want to touch them. Touch, you can only watch this little brother getting stronger day by day. Obviously, Chengguo does not want Zioan to become the second Chu state. King Huai flipped through the information in his hand, smiled somewhat self-deprecatingly, and said, "In a country of etiquette, who is the country of etiquette? Some people are full of benevolence, justice, and morality, but they are full of male thieves and female prostitutes." After being in contact with King Huai for a long time, Tang Ning gradually realized that although he looked like a salty fish, he actually had the soul of an angry young man. Tang Ning was also reading information about Zioan, and could understand King Huai's mood at the moment. Although he is not from Chen country, he is at least half of it. As half of Chen country, he feels only shame at this moment. Compared with Chen state, Zioan is more like a state of etiquette. They treated the prisoners more humanely and humanely. When they treated the Chen prisoners of war well, the Chen people went to the western regions together, robbed ordinary people, sold them back to the country, and used them as slaves. In their country, women can also serve as officials. This is a joke in Chen state. The great Confucianists laughed at them because they had reversed yin and yang and messed up the ethical principles. Soon the country would be destroyed. In their country, nobles broke the law and were guilty of the same crime as the common people. At this time, the powerful officials of Chen state were still buying people's lives with money. In the eyes of others, Zioan is a joke. In Tang Ning's eyes, the other party's system and structure had surpassed Chen state and the world by who knows how many years. There should be no big difference between the Chen people in the eyes of Zioan people and the Sushan people in the eyes of Chen people. A small country that has been oppressed and humiliated for decades has gradually grown stronger through its own efforts and is finally able to stand up and take charge. They want to resist oppression and fight back against the thugs who treat their citizens like livestock. No matter how you look at it, they are all positive characters. King Huai sorted out his thoughts and said, freedom, equality, justice, rule of law, this is what the Chen country should be like. Only today did I understand that Lord Tang's structure is far above ours. Where is it? Tang Ning waved her hand and said, I just stood on the shoulders of giants. The proposal jointly put forward by the right Prime Minister and King Huai was taken seriously by all officials, and soon caused a storm in the court. In fact, Zioan has sent envoys several times to negotiate with some dignitaries in the capital about robbing the people of the western regions and using them as slaves, but to no avail. Chen state is a country of etiquette, and this kind of etiquette permeates all aspects, even war. There are war etiquette. The two countries went to war, beheaded envoys, massacred innocent people, kidnapped them and used them as slaves, and humiliated them wantonly. This was what the people of Chen considered barbarians to do. However, now, some people in Chen are playing the role of barbarians. If they treat the Sushan people like this, it would be fine. After all, they have a blood feud with the state of Chen, but the western regions have always obeyed their orders. For the sake of interests, those people, whether they are Zioan people or people from other small countries, will snatch back any women with some beauty when they sweep the western regions. Some officials in the court were ashamed of the actions of some powerful people in the capital, and they reported to the court on their behalf, but it still did not work. This matter involves not only etiquette, but also interests. Some people in the capital rely on these to make money. Cutting off people's money in this way will definitely cause them to attack frantically. Officials in the court have been silent about this because of their power. This time, with the right Prime Minister and King Huai taking the lead, the court immediately responded countless times, which shows that the ministers have been ashamed of this matter for a long time. Zhou family. Duke Zhou Wu of Zhao looked gloomy and asked, really? A man standing below him said, today he and King Huai proposed this proposal in the palace, and countless people agreed. Although His Majesty did not directly issue an order, he did not oppose it either. Zhou Wu slapped the table and said angrily, it's not enough that he bullied Qing he also wants to cut off the foundation of my Zhou family. More than 90% of the Zhou family's business is related to this matter. If the court prohibits them from going to the western regions to arrest people, it will directly cut off the Zhou family's source of income. This is something he will never allow. Zhou Wu looked heavy, and after a moment, he stood up suddenly and said, get ready, I want to go to the palace. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 819. Royal Palace. In the Imperial Garden, Zhao Man supported the Queen Mother and walked slowly in the Imperial Garden. Since the Queen Mother pays attention to her diet and takes regular walks, her condition has gradually improved. Although she has not recovered, she has stabilized to a state where she does not get sick frequently. The two walked for a while, and the Queen Mother looked at Zhao Man who was distracted and said, okay, you don't have to listen to your father. You can stay with the AI family in the palace all day, and go out and do your own thing bar. I don't have anything to do. Zhao Man shook his head and said, I want to spend more time with the imperial grandmother in the palace. The Queen Mother paused, turned to look at her, and asked, are you leaving? Zhao Man looked a little flustered and asked, what, why are you leaving? Okay, it's just the two of us here. You grew up in the lap of the AI family. There's nothing we can't say. The Queen Mother touched her head and said, the AI family's little manor was still there back then. It's crawling on the ground, It's so big in a blink of an eye, and it's time to leave the AI family and your majesty. Zhao Man lowered his head and said, I won't leave, I won't go anywhere. It's good to go, it's good to go. The Queen Mother looked at her and said, the palace is not suitable for you. If you want to go, just go farther. The farther you go, the better. The farther you go, those dirty things, the farther away you are. Zhao Man looked at her and said in surprise, the Queen Mother. No more, no more. The Queen Mother waved her hand and said, when people get old, they always like to make these complaints. The two of them walked in the imperial garden for another quarter of an hour, when suddenly a palace maid walked in quickly and said, Queen Mother, Duke Zhao wants to see you. The Queen Mother looked at her and said, let's go. The AI family hasn't seen him for a long time. Zhao Man stayed alone, and the Queen Mother walked to a pavilion in front, where an old man stood respectfully. The Queen Mother walked over and asked, why do you have time to come to the palace today? Zhou Wu looked at the Queen Mother, with a look of sadness and anger on his face, and said, you have to make the decision for Qing. Zhou Qing is a single descendant of the Zhou family. Although the Queen Mother has been in the palace for many years, she often pays attention to the affairs of the Zhou family. She frowned when she heard this and asked, what's wrong with Qing? Zhou Wu squeezed out a few tears and said, he had his hands and feet broken, and the doctor said he might have to lie in bed for the rest of his life and become a cripple. The Queen Mother put on a serious face and asked, what is going on? Qing was beaten and seriously injured by a villain. That person was originally imprisoned in the Ministry of Punishment, waiting for retribution, but the Ministry of Punishment actually protected the villain and let her go. This clearly means that they do not take the Zhou family seriously and do not treat the Queen Mother. Take it seriously. The Queen Mother looked at him and asked, Qing is seriously injured. Zhou Wudao, Qing was almost beaten to death by them in the street. He didn't provoke that person at all, but that person did this to him. My poor Qing. Okay, okay. The Queen Mother glanced at him and said, I will let your majesty investigate this matter. After a while, the imperial study room. Emperor Chen looked at Zhou Wu and asked, is this happening? It's absolutely true. Zhou Wu raised his palm and said, if I tell a lie, I will die badly. Uncle, you don't have to be like this. Emperor Chen waved his hand, looked at Wei Jian, and said, summon the Minister of Punishment into the palace. Wei Jian pursed his lips and said, Your Majesty, for this matter, just calling the Minister of Punishment into the palace may not be enough. Chen Huang asked, why? Wei Jiandao, because Master Tang ordered this matter. Huang Chen frowned and said, Tang Ning. Wei Jian looked at Emperor Chen and said, Your Majesty was unwell the past few days, so I didn't tell you about it. Emperor Chen looked at Zhao Qiuagong, but he could no longer take back his life. After thinking about it, he said, summon him into the palace. Tang Mansion. Tang Ning looked at Tang Shui and asked, are you going to the western regions? Tang Shui nodded and said, I want to go see Zioan. Maybe my parents are still alive. Tang Ning could understand her thoughts and nodded, you might as well go and have a look. I heard that you bought all the Zioan slaves they kidnapped. Do you have enough money? Tang Shuidao, it's still a little worse. Tang Ning walked back to the study, then walked out quickly, handed her a box, and said, here is 100,000 taels. You can use it first. If it's not enough, we won't worry. Tang Shui wanted to refuse, but after thinking about it, he took it and said, you don't need that much. Tang Ning said, you can take the rest. This trip is a long one, and there will always be times when you need money. Princess Anyang stood aside, looking at the wooden box in Tang Shui's hand. Her throat moved, and she looked at Tang Ning and said, actually, if you think about it carefully, you are related to our royal family. In other words, I am also considered to be you my sister. Tang Ning said, Concubine Tang Hui is concubine Tang Hui, and I am me. Princess Anyang said, what about Xiao Man? She is my sister. You are the one. Shouldn't you also call me sister? Tang Ning said, even if I call you sister, I still have to pay back the 10,000 taels. Princess Anyang glanced at him and said, I don't have a brother like you. Tang Ning wanted to say something more to Tang Shui, but when she looked up, she saw Wei Jian's face. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, Your Majesty summoned you. Wei Jian nodded. Tang Ning didn't take out the apple from her sleeve this time, and asked tentatively, what's the reason for this time? Wei Jian said, Duke Zhao went to the palace and complained about you in front of His Majesty and the Queen Mother because of Zhou Qing's matter. Tang Shui's face changed slightly when he heard this. Although Tang Ning's expression did not change, he was a little surprised. Tang Shui was wrong about Zhou Qing's matter, but the Zhou family was not completely right. He had written a letter of apology to the Zhou family and sent a large card of valuable gifts. Although the Zhou family did not reply, they accepted the gifts, which was considered as tacit consent to the matter. If he had not intended to let Tang Shui go, he could have refused those gifts, and Tang Ning would have known what he meant. However, he accepted the gifts, and 2 days later, he went to the palace to complain again. It must be said that Duke Zhao did a very unkind thing in this matter. Wei Jian looked at him and said, Lord Tang, let's go. Tang Shui was about to speak, but Tang Ning held out his hand and said, it's okay, I can handle it. Just wait at home and don't go anywhere. After that, he looked at Wei Jian and said, let's go. Watching them leave, Tang Shui frowned and asked, why did Duke Zhao regret it? Don't you know that more than half of the western region slaves in the capital are from the Zhou family? Princess Anyang looked at her and said, he cut off the Zhou family's financial resources. How could the Zhou family let him go? You said you were just his cousin. Princess Anyang looked at her and shook her head. I am also his cousin, why don't you treat me so well? He offended so many powerful people for me, offended His Majesty and the Queen Mother. Why didn't he give me 100,000 taels of silver? Stop complaining. Tang Shui grabbed her hand and said, go to the palace quickly and help me find out some news. Tang Ning followed Wei Jian into the palace, walked into the imperial study, and bowed, saying, Your Majesty, I pay my respects to you. Emperor Chen looked at him and asked, Duke Zhao, you used your position as Prime Minister to seek personal gain and release prisoners privately. Is this true? Tang Ning opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a figure suddenly ran in from outside. Princess Anyang stood in the hall, looking at Emperor Chen, aggrieved, Uncle Huang, you have to make a decision for Anyang. Tang Ning looked at her and saw that her face was full of tears, her body was trembling slightly, and she looked like she had suffered a great injustice. She was stunned in place. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 820. In the Imperial Study Room, Emperor Chen was also stunned. He looked at Princess Anyang and said, what exactly happened? Please tell me slowly. Anyang was mature and sensible, and was deeply loved by the Queen Mother. Although she was the princess, Emperor Chen treated her better than ordinary princesses. Princess Anyang wiped away her tears, her voice slightly choked, and said, someone said dirty words to Anyang, not only wanting to beat Anyang, but also insulting the royal family. Emperor Chen's face darkened and he said, who is so bold? Princess Anyang pointed to Zhao Qiuagong and said, it is Zhao Qiuagong's son Zhou Qing. Not only did he instruct his servants to beat us, he also said he would kill the 9 tribes in Anyang. Duke Zhao Guo stood in the hall, sweating heavily and his back was soaked with sweat. It's enough to insult the princess. To kill her 9 clans is to kill the royal family. Isn't it rebellion? The Zhou family cannot afford such a crime. He knelt down with a pop and said urgently, Your Majesty, my son will never say such treacherous words. Princess, you can't slander my son like this. Princess Anyang wiped her tears, lowered her head and said, He ordered his servants to whip us with whips, and also said many unpleasant words. I vaguely remember the sentence. Zhou Wu's body was trembling. Princess Anyang's words were specious, so he couldn't refute. I vaguely remember. This was an attempt to incriminate. Emperor Chen looked at Zhou Wu and said, What a good son my uncle taught me. Zhou Wu did not dare to explain at all. He looked horrified, knelt on the ground, and said loudly, I failed to teach my son well, and I am guilty. Chen Huang waved his hand and said, For the sake of the Queen Mother, I will not care about this matter with him. You go back and discipline him more. If he does it again, I will not be lenient. Zhou Wu knelt down and said, I obey the decree. Duke Zhao panicked and retreated. Tang Ning glanced at Princess Anyang. What happened that day was obviously not what Princess Anyang said. According to her, after Tang Shui started fighting with those people, she hid aside. Zhou Qing, who came later, didn't see her at all. Otherwise, how could he give Princess Anyang some face? As for Tang Shui, the Tang family has declined to this point, and the capital which has become a thing of the past, but Zhou Qing has not taken it seriously. Emperor Chen looked at Princess Anyang and said, Although Zhou Qing offended you, he has also been punished. Let this end here. Princess Anyang said obediently, Listen to Uncle Huang. Chen Huang nodded and said, Anyang will go down first, Tang Ning will stay. Princess Anyang glanced at Tang Ning, turned around and walked out of the imperial study. Tang Ning stood in the palace, waiting for Emperor Chen to speak. Emperor Chen paced in the palace and said, The imperial court wants to send troops to help the countries in the western regions and resist Zioan. The actions of those in the capital should really stop. I thought about it and think what you and King Huai said makes sense. Our country, Chen, is a country of etiquette and cannot imitate the barbarians. From now on, they are strictly prohibited from plundering the people of the western regions and selling them back to Beijing. Tang Ning cupped her hands and said, Your Majesty is wise. The western region is very big, and Zioan is the most dangerous place for those people. When they arrive in the western region, they don't care which country they are in. They are like robbers, robbing everyone they see. Now Chen State and many small countries in the western region have achieved this. If the cooperative relationship continues like this, it will cause dissatisfaction among the allies. This is also the reason why there are so many people in the court who support him and King Huai. Huang Chen asked his opinion on several major events that had happened in the DPRK recently. He felt sleepy after a while and waved to Tang Ning to leave. King Kang's rebellion was a serious blow to Chen Guo. In the past, he seemed to be tireless when reviewing memorials and talking about state affairs. Now he looks a little haggard and has aged much in a short period of time. Tang Ning walked out of the imperial study room, and Princess Anyang was standing in front waiting for him. When she saw Tang Ning approaching, she raised an eyebrow and asked, How is it? Perfect. Tang Ning nodded, convinced by her acting skills just now. If he hadn't known it beforehand, he might have believed her lies. Princess Anyang asked, Is that all? Tang Ning thought for a while and said, There is no need to pay back the 10,000 taels of silver. Although Princess Anyang's acting skills just now were impeccable, the reward of 10,000 taels for just a few minutes of performance was definitely worthy of the tears she just shed. 10,000 taels of silver can solve an urgent need, but it will eventually be spent. Princess Anyang has seen how wealthy he is today. If he can treat her like Tang Shui, won't she never have to worry about money in the future? Already. What a wonderful thing. Princess Anyang showed a warm smile on her face and said, If it weren't for me today, you would have suffered the consequences of Zhao Qiuagong. You see, you won't suffer so much if you call me sister, right? Tang Ning could tell that Princess Anyang was not satisfied with the 10,000 taels of silver. What she wanted was more 10,000 taels. If he really recognized the sister, Fairy Tang would definitely not let him go. Of course, Tang Ning herself was not willing to be taken advantage of. He shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, I can only have one sister." Princess Anyang looked at him and said angrily, "How can I be inferior to Shui-er?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "She is still my fiancée, you are not." Princess Anyang looked at Tang Ning leaving, her chest rising and falling. Although she wanted money, she didn't want to involve herself in it for the sake of money. She glared angrily in the direction Tang Ning left, gritted her teeth and said, "What a bastard." Zhou family. Zhou Wu returned home, walked to Zhou Qing's bed, and said angrily, "Did you insult Princess Anyang that day?" Zhou Qing looked innocent and said, "I didn't see her at all that day." Zhou Wuodao, she was in the palace just now, saying that you said dirty words to her and wanted to punish her 9 tribes. Zhou Qing trembled and said loudly, "She is slandering. I didn't see her at all that day, let alone said those words. At that time, there was only that woman from the Tang family. The Tang family is gone now, so I let them and him hands on." In that case, why did Princess Anyang want to excuse him? Zhou Wu looked suspicious and murmured, "Did they get together?" Zhou Qing looked at him and asked, "Dad, does the court really not allow us to go to the western regions to arrest people? What about those people who have been captured?" Zhou Wu had a look of reluctance on his face and said, "Let's move them to another place first." Snatching slaves from the western regions and selling them to dignitaries in the capital was the Zhou family's biggest financial source. In the process, they also had to take risks. The western region is vast and sparsely populated. It only takes 100 people to form a strong force. These hundreds of people are enough to deal with a small country with a small population, but a big country like Zioan is not so easy to mess with. If you are not careful, you may even be in danger of being wiped out. Zhou Wu was depressed, and some servants came to report it. Several dignitaries from the capital came to visit. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 821. The 816th chapter of the main text of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun. The couples who visited the Duke of Zhao's mansion were Yongping Marquis, Yushun Marquis, and others. In the capital, there are some families like this. Although they are powerful, the entire family only has one title left. In addition to receiving some salary from the court every year, they have no real power. After several years, this remaining title will be redeprived by the court with the passing of a generation. Yongping Marquis, Yushun Marquis, including the Zhou family, are such families. The short period of time after that is the last light they can ignite in the capital. For these families, revitalizing is already a luxury. In the absence of successors in the family, they will eventually decline. However, even if they decline, there are 2 situations. Some families will have nothing after the decline, and some families have accumulated enough wealth long before the decline. Relying on the family's little shadow, they can still enjoy themselves in the capital for many years. Yongping Ho Yushun Ho and others had long given up hope of reviving their family. Over the years, they followed the Zhou family and made a lot of money. Even if they lost their titles, they could still live the same life as now. They only did one business over the years, which was to send people to the western regions to plunder those beautiful western women and sell them to the dignitaries in the capital at a high price. These families used to have some small businesses in Kyoto, but none of the profits could compare to this business without capital. Over time, they only did this business. Now, the court wants to ban their business, which means they will cut off their retreat. After hearing the news, several people gathered at Zhou's house to discuss countermeasures. We are arresting people from the western regions. What does it have to do with Tang Ning and King Huai? Is there any benefit for them to do this? The last tax reform was initiated by them. The two of them have repeatedly cut off our financial resources. Duke Zhao, didn't you go to the palace today? What did the Queen Mother say? In this business, they have always been headed by the Zhou family, and Duke Zhao Zhouwu is naturally their backbone. Zhouwu was upset and waved his hand, saying, "What else can I say? The whole court is now one-sided. This matter must not be done openly in the future." What? Then how much silver will we lose? One person's face changed drastically and said, "I have received a deposit of 100,000 taels for the next batch of goods. Now I am told that I can't do it. How can I explain to the buyer?" Zhouwu glanced at Yang Pingho and said, "There has never been a shortage of buyers for goods in the western regions. Who asked you to rush to collect the silver?" Yang Pingho's face was gloomy. The deposits of those buyers had been given to him. He used the silver to hire a lot of people and was about to go to the western regions. However, the court prohibited them from going to the western regions to rob people at this juncture. Wouldn't it cut off his financial path? This is not the most important thing. The important thing is that he has been squandering money in recent years. Every time he has silver in his hand, he will soon gamble it all away. Now that the business is over, how can he pay back the silver to those people? Which of those buyers is not a powerful person? If he can't make friends and can't pay them back, he will die a very ugly death. Zhouwu said, "I can't do anything about this matter. You can do it yourself. Jota, send the guests away." Yang Pingho looked at him and said hurriedly, "Duke Zhao, Marquis Yushun, we are all in the same boat. You can't ignore me." Zhouwu glanced at him and said, "This is the trouble you caused. It has nothing to do with us. You can solve it yourself." These dignitaries came to Zhou's house with worries, and soon they returned disappointed. If the court does not allow them to do this again, they naturally cannot go against His Majesty and the court officials in the hall. At most, they will just turn this matter from the open to the underground. As for letting them give up completely, this is of course impossible. This is their only and most important source of income. Giving up this matter means that they will have to eat up all the money they have accumulated, and their accumulated wealth will soon be lost. Compared with them, Yang Pingho is obviously more miserable. He likes gambling and is extravagant. If the court bans this business, he will immediately fall into a dilemma. This time, he received the money from those people and had already gathered all the people, but such a thing happened at this time. Not only did he lose both money and people, but he also had to think carefully about how to explain to those bigwigs behind him. After walking out of the Zhou family gate, Yang Pingho quickly caught up with someone and said, "Yu Shunho, please stay." Yu Shunho stopped. Yang Pingho walked up and said with a smile, "I'm a little tight on money recently. I wonder if Yu Shunho can help me." Yu Shunho looked embarrassed and said, "I'm not well off." He knew the character of Yang Pingho very well. If he lent the money, he might be throwing meat buns at a dog. It would never come back. Yang Pingho said, "As long as Yu Shunho can help me through this difficult time, I will remember your kindness for the rest of my life." Yu Shunho looked at him and asked, "How much do you want?" Yang Pingho said, 100,000 taels. Yu Shunho shook his head and said, 100,000 taels is too much. I can't afford it even if I sell all my money. Yang Pingho said, "Then how much can you lend me?" Yu Shunho thought for a while and said, 100 taels. When Yang Pingho returned to the mansion, he could no longer suppress his anger. He took out the 100 taels of silver that Yu Shunho had lent him from his sleeve and tore it into pieces. He frowned and said angrily, "How dare you humiliate me like this?" He took a deep breath, calmed down, raised his head, and found a figure standing in the yard. The man looked back at him and asked, when will the 20 Western region maids arrive? The face of Yang Pingho changed, and he said, listen to me, the court recently. We don't care about the affairs of the court. The man looked at him and said, it's the rule to take money to do things. If you break the rules, it's not good for anyone. Either you hand over the people when the time comes, or return the silver we gave you double. Otherwise, it won't be me who comes to you next time. A long time after the man left, Yang Pingho stood in the yard, his face pale, as if his soul had been taken away. After an unknown period of time, he raised his head, his face extremely gloomy, and gritted his teeth and said, Tang Ning, King Huai, the surname Zhou, you forced me to do this. Today in the imperial study, after Princess Anyang left, what Emperor Chen said to him showed that he agreed with the proposal of Tang Ning and King Huai. These grey industries have existed in Chen state for a long time, and they are usually hidden in the dark, where no one can see. When these things were brought to the table, the Chen people, who had the word etiquette engraved in their bones, could not hold their faces. Tang Shui's case was completely settled by Princess Anyang's disturbance. Tang Ning turned his head and looked at the pavilion behind him, hoping that after this incident, Princess Anyang would not try to take his money again. In the pavilion, Tang Shui looked at Princess Anyang and said, thank you. No need to thank me. Princess Anyang glanced at Tang Ning and said indignantly, it's still that your majesty is biased towards him, otherwise, this matter would not be so easy to end. Speaking of this matter, she remembered Tang Ning's disdain for her in the palace, and she felt a little ashamed, but when she thought of what he said later, she felt a little more balanced. After all, in addition to being his cousin, Tang Shui was also his wife who had not yet married into the family. She was indeed a stranger who could not compare. She looked at Tang Shui, then glanced at Tang Ning who was not far away, and said, don't mention it, you two look like a couple. Tang Shui glared at her and said angrily, you are the only one who looks like a couple. Paused.